Welcome back. Genuinely glad you're joining us again today.
As usual, you'll find a full glossary in the description for any terminology that might trip you up. No excuses not to follow along.
Right. Let's get into it.
Jake, I want to tackle something today that I genuinely think is one of the more philosophically interesting ethical questions of our time, even though most people treat it as either completely obvious or completely off-limits for discussion.
The ethics of eating meat.
Exactly. And what strikes me is how polarized the conversation has become. On one side, you have people who treat any questioning of meat eating as a personal attack on their culture, their identity, or their autonomy. On the other, you sometimes get a kind of moral certainty from vegans and animal rights advocates that can feel just as dismissive of complexity. I want to try and do something different today, which is think through it carefully and honestly.
I think that's the right approach. And I'd start by noting that this is genuinely a hard philosophical problem, not just a lifestyle preference dressed up as ethics. The core tension is this. We generally accept as a foundational moral principle that causing unnecessary suffering is wrong. And there is now overwhelming scientific consensus that many of the animals we eat, mammals, birds, fish, are sentient. They experience pain, fear, and distress in ways that are neurologically and behaviorally very similar to our own.
Which means that the standard justification for eating meat, it's natural or we've always done it, doesn't actually engage with the ethical question at all. Plenty of things that are natural or historically common are nonetheless morally wrong. The appeal to nature is a well-documented logical fallacy.
Right. The is-ought gap, as Hume framed it. The fact that something is the case tells us nothing about whether it ought to be the case. We have always eaten meat is a descriptive claim, not a normative one. It tells you what people do, not what people should do.
So if we set aside the naturalistic fallacy and the appeal to tradition, what arguments are actually left for the moral permissibility of eating meat?
Several, actually. And I think some of them are more serious than they're usually given credit for in these debates.
The most philosophically interesting defense of meat eating, in my view, is what's sometimes called the replaceability argument, associated with Peter Singer's early utilitarian framework, though he ultimately rejected it. The idea is that if an animal lives a good life and is killed painlessly, the harm done to it is offset by the existence of a replacement animal that also gets to live a good life. Net happiness is preserved.
Which is a coherent utilitarian argument on its own terms, but it runs into serious problems fairly quickly. First, it seems to imply that it would be permissible to kill humans painlessly and replace them with other happy humans, which most people find intuitively monstrous. And if we resist that conclusion for humans, we need a principled reason why animals are different, beyond just saying because they're not human, which is simply speciesism.
That's the charge Peter Singer himself levels, that treating the interests of one species as automatically more important than those of another, purely on the basis of species membership, is a form of arbitrary discrimination that doesn't withstand philosophical scrutiny.
Though there are philosophers who push back on that. The argument that humans have a special moral status by virtue of rationality, self-awareness, or the capacity for complex future-directed desires, what's sometimes called personhood in the philosophical sense, is a serious position with a long history.
Kant being the obvious reference point. For Kant, moral consideration applies to rational agents, beings capable of acting according to principles. Animals, on this view, lack the relevant rational capacities and therefore don't hold the same moral status.
But the Kantian line has its own vulnerabilities. If full moral status requires rationality, what do we say about human infants or people with severe cognitive disabilities who also lack the relevant capacities? Most people have the very strong intuition that these individuals deserve full moral protection. But if that protection isn't grounded in rationality, then rationality cannot be the criterion that excludes animals either.
That's what philosophers call the argument from marginal cases. And I think it's genuinely difficult to get around without either biting some very uncomfortable bullets or grounding moral status in something other than cognitive capacity.
Which tends to bring you back to sentience, the capacity to suffer, as the morally relevant criterion. And once you accept that, the case for treating animal suffering as ethically insignificant becomes very hard to sustain.
I want to complicate the picture slightly, because I think the ethical analysis changes quite significantly depending on context. There is a meaningful moral difference between a factory farm producing cheap chicken for a supermarket in a wealthy country and an indigenous community in the Arctic that has subsisted on animal protein for thousands of years with no viable alternative.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's a distinction the more absolutist strands of the animal rights movement sometimes fail to make with sufficient care. The ethical weight of an action depends partly on necessity, on alternatives, and on the broader context of power and history. Applying the same moral judgment to subsistence hunting and industrial animal agriculture strikes me as a kind of moral blindness masquerading as consistency.
It's also worth noting that food is deeply entangled with culture, memory, and identity in ways that are not straightforwardly reducible to a trolley problem-style ethical calculation. When my grandmother made a specific dish that her mother taught her, and her mother's mother before that, there is a form of meaning and continuity embedded in that practice that has genuine human value and that an abstract ethical argument can't simply dissolve away.
I'm sympathetic to that, genuinely. But I'd want to be careful that cultural significance doesn't become a get-out clause that immunizes any practice from moral scrutiny. Plenty of historically and culturally embedded practices have been revised or abandoned in light of expanding moral understanding. The question is whether the cultural value in this case outweighs the harm.
And I don't think there's a clean, universal answer to that, which is part of what makes this an ethics question rather than a math problem. You are weighing genuinely incommensurable values: animal welfare, human culture, necessity, sustainability, autonomy, against each other. And reasonable people, reasoning carefully, can end up in different places.
Though I'd argue that reasonable people can disagree is sometimes used to foreclose a conversation that should actually be continuing. The fact that a question is hard doesn't mean all answers are equally defensible.
Agreed. The difficulty of a question is not a license for intellectual abdication.
I think there's one part of this debate where the ethical picture is, if not simple, at least significantly clearer, and that's industrial factory farming. Because whatever your view on the abstract ethics of killing animals for food, the conditions in which the majority of farmed animals live their lives are very difficult to defend on almost any ethical framework.
That's a point I find genuinely hard to argue with. We're talking about systems in which animals are kept in conditions that cause chronic physical and psychological suffering, not as a side effect of an otherwise humane process, but as a structural feature of the system, because suffering is cheaper than the alternative.
And the scale is almost incomprehensible. Roughly 80 billion land animals are slaughtered for food every year globally. The majority of them spend their lives in conditions that would be considered abusive if applied to a pet dog or cat. The moral inconsistency there, the distinction we make between companion animals and food animals, is largely arbitrary and culturally contingent.
The philosopher's term for that inconsistency is moral circle, the idea that throughout history we have progressively extended the boundary of who counts morally, from tribe to nation to all humans, to arguably all sentient beings. And the question is whether our treatment of farmed animals represents a glaring blind spot in our current moral circle that future generations will look back on with the same discomfort we feel when we look back at slavery or the disenfranchisement of women.
I find that framing genuinely persuasive, not as a rhetorical device, but as a serious historical argument. Moral progress is real, and part of what drives it is people being willing to ask uncomfortable questions about the gap between their stated values and their actual practices.
Which is, ultimately, what this conversation is. Not a verdict, not a guilt trip, just an honest attempt to think clearly about something most of us would rather not think about at all.
And thinking clearly about it doesn't necessarily mean arriving at the conclusion that everyone must go vegan immediately. It might mean reducing consumption. It might mean choosing higher welfare products when that's accessible. It might mean supporting policy changes to regulate factory farming more stringently. There are many points on the spectrum between ignore it entirely and moral perfection.
The intellectually honest position, I think, is to acknowledge that there is a genuine ethical problem here, one that most of us, myself included, have not fully resolved in our own lives, and to take that seriously rather than defaulting to whichever rationalization is most convenient.
That might be the most honest thing we've said in 12 episodes.
Possibly. I want to bring in one more dimension before we close, which is the technological one. because there's an emerging reality that might change the terms of this debate quite fundamentally over the next few decades, and that's cultivated meat, what's sometimes called lab-grown meat or cell-cultured meat.
The idea of growing animal protein directly from animal cells without the need to raise or slaughter an entire animal.
Exactly. Several companies are already producing it commercially, or very close to doing so. And from a purely consequentialist standpoint, it looks like a fairly elegant solution. You get the product without most of the harm. No factory farming, dramatically lower land and water use, significantly fewer emissions, and in principle, no animal suffering at all.
Though I'd want to flag that the no suffering claim needs scrutiny. The initial cell lines still require biopsies from living animals, and the growth media used in the culturing process has historically included fetal bovine serum, which is extracted in a way that is far from painless. The industry is working on alternatives, but it's not clean yet.
A fair and important caveat, though the trajectory seems clearly towards reducing those harms substantially, even if it hasn't fully arrived there yet.
What I find philosophically interesting about cultivated meat is that it doesn't actually resolve the underlying ethical question. It sidesteps it. It says, here is a technological workaround that means you don't have to change your values or your habits. We'll just change the production method, which might be the most practically effective approach, but it feels like a slightly unsatisfying philosophical answer.
That's a really sharp observation. It's a bit like solving the problem of drunk driving by inventing a car that drives itself, rather than addressing the underlying culture around alcohol and risk. The immediate harm is reduced, which is genuinely good, but the deeper question, what do we actually owe to other sentient creatures, and what kind of relationship do we want to have with the natural world, is quietly shelved.
And those deeper questions have a habit of resurfacing in new forms. If we accept cultivated meat as the solution to animal agriculture, what's our framework when the next dilemma arrives? Cultivated human tissue for medical purposes, or AI systems that might be sentient? The ethical reasoning we develop now has implications well beyond what's on our dinner plate.
Which is why the philosophical work is worth doing, even if the technology eventually makes it feel less urgent. You can't outsource your ethics to your engineers.
That might be the most quotable thing you've said in 12 episodes.
I'll take it.
And now we want to hear from you, because this is exactly the kind of topic where the comments section tends to generate genuinely interesting discussion.
Our question for today, where do you stand on this? Do you think eating meat can be ethically justified? And if so, under what conditions? We're not looking for a simple yes or no. We want your reasoning.
Write it in the comments in English. Even a few sentences is great practice at this level, and we genuinely read and think about every response.
And as always, what topics do you want us to cover in future episodes? Philosophy, science, psychology, current affairs, culture? Anything goes. Your suggestions shape this show directly, so drop them below.
If today's episode made you think, share it with someone who likes a good intellectual challenge. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. This one genuinely had me thinking long after we finished recording.
The glossary is in the description. Rich vocabulary for philosophy, ethics, and academic English. See you next time.
Take care.
Bye.